So, namaskar, everybody. Thanks for joining us at a very short notice. Um, it's great to be among friends today. Um, Today is a very special occasion, and we are starting a series today. And this year is Sri Sitaram Goel ji's 100th birth anniversary year, centenary year, and we have many programs scheduled. So this is just one of them. We are going to do 6 sessions in total on different subjects, and I will reintroduce our main speaker, and I will also introduce my co-moderator, Sri Nalini Vanaparthiji. You can see him on the screen. And about Sitaram Goel, most people know it and know his work, but this is a very special occasion. So I will just take a couple of minutes to reintroduce Sitaram Goel to our audience. Some of you may be of a later generation. So everybody knows about India's political freedom or the freedom struggle. And depending on what your historic timeline is, that Hindu freedom struggle started long time back, probably started with Vijayanagar Empire, Hariyar and Bukka, or even earlier. Whenever we say freedom struggle, most probably we mean freedom from the British, I mean in popular parlance, not our kind of people. And be as it may, there was a freedom struggle, and finally we had independence. Similarly, there has been an intellectual freedom struggle as well. Intellectually, our discourse has been compromised, colonized from within and from the outside both. Hence, that slavery, that mental slavery, there has also been a corresponding freedom struggle. So without going too much into detail on Sitaram Goel ji, I will just contextualize his role. So freedom from the British colonialism and what Netaji had a role in that is the corresponding role played by Sitaram Goel in the intellectual freedom struggle. And even more, you can say the later part of intellectual freedom struggle, Sitaram Goel ji is the founder or the father of that intellectual freedom struggle. And his work is as relevant as today as it was when he had started in the 50s and 60s. And for many more, maybe another 100 years to come, because the task of freedom is not done. It's a work in progress, and we are progressing, and there has been a considerable change. So to walk through this, the role of Sitaram Goel ji in our intellectual freedom struggle, we have our distinguished speaker, Dr. Conrad Elst. And again, everybody knows him, but just to reintroduce and contextualize Dr. Elst's role, what maybe, and I hope Dr. Elst can comment on this. So what Annie Besant played a role in Indian freedom struggle, that Elst is playing in this intellectual freedom struggle. So today I have taken the risk of equating Dr. Elst with Annie Besant, but Dr. Elst also is in that freedom struggle, and his name is also there as freedom fighters in this intellectual freedom struggle. So with that, I will, these 6 sessions that we are doing. So today's session is focused on communism. So communism, people think that equate with Communist Party of India and say that hey, they have just 5 seats in the Lok Sabha, so what's the big deal? So no, that's not true. If there is a ruling ideology today, regardless of political dispensation, it is some flavor of communist thought or embedded in it, or an internalized version of communist thought. So it's not just the official communism that is that is under scrutiny. There is a communist consciousness or a Marxist consciousness that pervades the political spectrum, including today's ruling party. So there needs to be a freedom struggle from this chain of communism and other isms that we are bound by. And Sitaram Goelji played a very prominent role in that. So with that, I will invite our distinguished speaker to walk us through the role of Sitaramji vis-a-vis communism. So Conradji, it is our great pleasure that we invite you to give this lecture.
Okay, thank you, Rajiv. So I will give a little PowerPoint, only 20 minutes or so, to introduce the subject, and then I strongly invite questions or comments. Yes. Right. Everybody can see this? So we're going to talk about Sitaram Goel, whom I have called in a commemoration volume after his untimely death in 2003. India's only communalist, because by that time he was, of course, mostly known as a writer on issues of Islam, Christianity. And he was quite frank, you know, when he was called communalist, he totally accepted this sobriquet. And so, whereas everybody in India was clamoring, no, I'm not a communalist, like, for instance, the Muslim leadership, who would be deemed arch-communalist by outsiders, still managed to pass as secularist, do everything in the name of secularism and so on. Goelji had no such compunctions. If they want to call me communalist, I am a communalist. So India's only communalist. Well, he started with a totally non-communal, non-religious involvement, namely with communism. So, oh my God. I see a mistake there. He was not born in 2021, but in 1921. Well, anyway, he studied, well, he had a fairly difficult childhood. They were pretty poor. He, for some years, he slept in school, in the classroom. He just had to clean it up before class started. And so on, but finally he made it. He went to university and winning scholarships and so on. He was a good student. And so he studied history at Delhi University. And meanwhile, he was active as a Gandhian activist. So he was part of the freedom struggle. And this involvement with the Gandhian movement is instrumental in the development towards communism. In this sense, as he analyzed afterwards, that the Gandhians were quite helpless before the then ongoing drift towards the left, because they didn't have an ideological backbone. They were centered on emotions, on cultivating an emotional attachment to the motherland, to the cause of non-violence. And so they didn't have an ideological backbone. And so when a mighty influence, a new ideological fashion came in, they could not hold their own ground. And so many of them came under the influence of this new ideological wind, namely Marxism. So he was gradually hanging out with the left. At that time, there was, for instance, the Congress Socialist Party with Jaya Prakash Narayan, whom he knew well for many years. And the leader of the later of the revolt against Indira Gandhi, which led to the emergency in the 1970s, where he was also very much involved on the pro-democratic side. Anyway, so back then, he started working for them, doing some translation work, finally ending up as the editor of their paper. But the very first editorial which he wrote was deemed too communist and too pro-communist, and therefore he was relieved of that duty. But so it just illustrates how he was getting closer and closer to communism. Unlike many others who are just enthusiasts because of a few slogans, he really read the communist classics. He knew theory and practice of communism. So he read Marx thoroughly, and even the further foundation of Marxist thought, namely Hegel. And so he was quite conversant with Marxist philosophy before even Marxist politics. He finally wanted to make it serious, become a full-time member of the Communist Party. But on that very day, at the behest of Home Minister Sardar Patel, the Communist Party of India was being banned. And so he was on very friendly terms with the communists. So they advised him, yeah, wait a little before becoming a member. This is just not a very good time. But meanwhile, Goelji came under the influence of his friend. Well, he had been under the influence of Ram Swarup, but Ram Swarup had not yet turned anti-communist yet, but by that time he had. And so the reason for this was mainly that in 1946-47, the Communist Party had supported the plan for partition. And so they gave it a certain respectability among intellectual Hindus by forging all kinds of non-religious arguments for it, saying that for the peasantry in Bengal, for example, the partition would be beneficial. And so that there were sort of communist reasons, not just Islamic reasons to support partition. So for freedom fighters who believed in India and in India's unity, this was too much. This was not acceptable. So it is first Ram Swarup who turned against communism. Then Sitaram Goel also started reading under the influence of Ram Swarup some books by ex-communists such as Viktor Kravchenko and Suzanne Labin, later also Frida Utley, and others. So that made him grow away from communism. I mean, these were people who had lived at close quarters through the Stalinist repression. In political circles, some people were aware of the communist danger, notably Home Minister Sardar Patel. And so he founded the Democratic Research Service, which was led by Minu Masani, for whom, in whose employ, Ram Swarup researched a book, The History of the CPI, which then Masani published under his own name. So this led to some bad blood between Masani and Ram Swarup. And so Ram Swarup left and joined the think tank, the anti-communist think tank, which meanwhile Sitaram Goel had founded in Kolkata, namely the Society for the Defense of freedom in Asia. That's a very important name. You see, the history of India will not be complete if this think tank is not mentioned. And so it earned some praise from anti-communists elsewhere, notably from Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Chinese Republic in Taiwan, and from some American politicians. Though mostly American and European politicians preferred to hang out with the more fashionable Nehruvian circles and spurned and ignored the work of the Society for the Defense of Freedom in Asia. Jawaharlal Nehru was the prime minister at the time, from 1947 to 1964. And he was not a straight communist. That, you know, in that case, the history of India would have gone a bit differently, but he was an admirer of communism, and he introduced some elements of communism, such as the economic 5-year plans, which were totally based on the Soviet model. He started socialist policies, stifling business, making businessmen who applied for permits feel like they were criminals, and on the whole, stifling the Indian economy. Of course, the British had plundered India's economy badly, but because of the Second World War, India got a fairly good start at as an independent country, because back then in war circumstances, India became the production center of the British Empire. And so the economy was growing fast. And if you compare with, for instance, how Germany and Japan have rebuilt after being destroyed by 1945, or how Korea built up from scratch after first being colonized by Japan, then destroyed in a terrible war in 1950-53. You see, they started from scratch, they built up magnificently. If you compare that to India's performance under Congress, it was a very sorry affair. India became a proverbial basket case. When people in the West wanted to talk about poverty, they always refer to India. And so the Nehruvians tried to justify themselves by blaming Hinduism. Like Raja Krishna, a friend of Sita Goel, but who became an ideologue of the, let's say, soft left, called it the Hindu rate of growth. And so it would be more proper to say it is the Nehru rate of growth. Anyway, so under Nehru and Indira, India was more or less as poor, as stay behind as the communist countries themselves. It's only after liberalization, which was when India was totally with its back against the wall economically, it started liberalizing under Narasimha Rao. But so until then, you had these socialist policies. So Nehru was a fake supporter of, I mean, he was like a typical Western leftist. You see, not really willing to suffer the consequences of his own leftist choices, but absolutely pitted against any smell of the right. The enmity was mutual. I mean, Goelji became a fairly well-known figure in India, certainly in political circles. So when Goelji wanted to apply for a passport in 1955, it was without explanation withheld after an intervention from Nehru himself. One of Nehru's colleagues in the freedom struggle, Rajagopalachari, who wanted to set up a party, a pro-free market party, anti-communist, namely the Swatantra Party. So when he was still in the first stages of building it up, the elections of 1957 came, the second parliamentary elections in India. And so Goelji was made a candidate. He was asked very much to become a candidate because he was deemed to be the only person who could stand up to Nehru. See, at the time, many politicians, including many who had historically been opposed to Nehru's policies, just didn't dare to stand against him anymore. In those days, a familiar phrase for the behavior of all the politicians trying to please Nehru, trying to be in his good books, was Nehru's harem, you know, where all the harem women compete with each other in pleasing the Lord as much as possible. So this was the atmosphere among politicians towards Nehru, whereas Goelji was deemed capable of standing up to Nehru. Unfortunately, he was not elected at the time. Congress was still all powerful. But the Swatantra Party would grow in the 60s, become the main opposition party by 1967, but was then destroyed quite effectively by Indira Gandhi. Like, for example, many of the former princes supported the Swatantra Party. And it is partly as a strategic move against the opposition that Indira abolished the princely privileges. So you see his political career ended there. He still worked ideologically against communism. In 1961-62, in Organizer, he published a article series which dealt with the communist menace, but mostly turned into a running argument against Nehru. And so the RSS leadership in the nationalist organization intervened with the editor, K.R. Malkani, to discontinue the series. And this, of course, disappointed Goelji. I mean, from then on, he's been very critical of this Hindu nationalist organization. But it also made sense to some extent, or at least we can understand the reasoning behind it. In 1948, someone associated with the RSS, not formally, but he had been a member, and ideologically was still on the RSS wavelength. He still sang the main nationalist song of the RSS on his way to the gallows. He assassinated Mahatma Gandhi. And so this is something that the RSS as an organization had never wanted and never considered. Though, of course, very many Hindus at that time, after partition, were against Mahatma Gandhi because he had not effectively opposed it. But the RSS as an organization never thought of assassination as a political weapon. They've never done any such thing. And in that case also, they had more or less foreseen what would happen in such a case. So they were, and that is effectively what did happen, namely an enormous state repression, even by a pro-Hindu home minister like Sardar Patel. And so the RSS was forbidden. All their stocks were confiscated. Many of their leaders were put in prison for a number of months. And so they feared that now, if anything would happen to Nehru, then this would be linked with Goelji's criticism of Nehru. And through an RSS-owned medium, the organizer. And so they feared that, again, the RSS would get the blame and the consequences. In 1962, China invaded India. Very interesting to hear Goelji's comments on this. And I am not sure he has written this anywhere. But he told me several times that this should be seen, because I mean, many times people have wondered to see, why did China invade India? Especially because apparently they had no strategic plan behind it. They didn't occupy a part of India. They could easily have taken India's northeast. Due to Nehru's policies, the Indian army was totally unready. And so they didn't. They invaded India and then they withdrew. It was not India's troops that drove them back. They themselves withdrew. Why did they do this? And so Goelji says, well, essentially this was meant as a pinprick against the Soviet Union. You see, India was perceived as a Soviet ally. Now, China had become embroiled with the Soviet Union. There had been skirmishes on the Manchuria border. And so the two communist giants had a policy of not attacking each other directly or avoiding this as much as possible. And so in their propaganda, the Chinese would attack Yugoslavia and the Soviets would attack Albania as allies of respectively the Soviet Union and China. And so the attack against India should be seen in that light. It was essentially a way of attacking the Soviet Union, of showing their battle readiness, showing their willingness to sacrifice, to fight. And so India itself was not really the target. And so Nehru there was, lost all his credibility. You know, he had been pro-communist, but not yet a formal communist. So he could still earn the ire of real communists. And so his complete unpreparedness, made him lose his shine to quite an extent. Goelji himself was put on the watch list because of a number of politicians, and probably Nehru himself thought he was very suspect, even though not suspect, of course, as an agent of the Chinese or so, but as a troublemaker, as somebody who could whip up some kind of sentiment among the people. But he was not arrested. And in fact, soon he was asked to work for a guerrilla behind the lines because they expected China to occupy the Northeast, which he didn't do. So they had wanted to start a guerrilla war behind the lines. Goelji was ready for nationalist reasons to join, but he made it conditional on the abdication by the man principally held guilty, namely Nehru. So nothing came of that. A very interesting effect of this Chinese invasion was that the reaction of the public was very pro-Indian. Until then, the Dravidianist party in Tamil Nadu had been separatist, had been openly demanding the separation of the South, or at least of Tamil Nadu, from India. Now, it turned out that even all their party activists suddenly rallied to the cause of the defense of India. The women sold their jewelry in order to donate the money to the army and things like that. So the public stood as one with India. And therefore, the Communist Party seemed to be an ally of China, and indeed they were. Like they had slogans like, China's chairman is also India's chairman. They were also with their back against the wall. And so Goelji concluded that for now, at least, for the foreseeable future, the rise of the Indian Communist Party was stopped. And that for the time being, at least, India would not fall into the lap of communism. Indeed, he characterized when Indira concluded a treaty of mutual defense with the Soviet Union, that in fact this was probably a good move. Like in the war with Pakistan over Bangladesh in 1971, it is the alliance with the Soviet Union that prevented the United States from coming to the aid of Pakistan and defeating India. And instead, you see, India could score a wonderful victory. So you see, in real life, in hard politics, sometimes you have to make strange alliances for the greater good. But so this didn't change his criticism of the Soviet Union itself or of Nehruism itself. I'll show you a few books here. One of the many publications of the Society of the Defense of Freedom in Asia is this World Conquest in Installments. It's an annotated translation of a few chapters written by Joseph Stalin himself in 1924. And so it lays out the strategy of the communists, how in a strategy developed by Lenin, they would not just make revolution everywhere and probably get beaten in many places, like happened outside Russia, in the Baltic and in Poland and in Hungary in around 1920. So they had a very systematic strategy of making alliances, going step by step. For instance, Goelji was not afraid of being assassinated by communists, even though he was their enemy number one in India, because he knew that terrorism is not part of the Leninist strategy. They believe in violence the day that the hour of revolution has struck. Then, of course, there are no bounds, no limitations on violence. But otherwise, they do not believe in terror. They think it's a childhood disease. But so they believe in making alliances and then moving step by step towards power. They are very goal-oriented. That's why they've, in spite of this setback, have succeeded not in politically taking over India, but at least in culturally becoming dominant. That would happen under Indira mostly around 1970. when Indira needed communist support for her intra-Congress power struggle. And so the deal was that in formal politics and in all the perks that go with political position, Indira's faction would have it, but for the control of the cultural and educational sector, that would go to the communists. And that's more or less what has happened since. But so that's a later story. At any rate, Goelji, together, of course, with his friend and mentor Ram Swarup, have written a history of resistance against communism, which will in the future be in golden letters in India's future history books. Thank you. Are there any comments or questions or so?
I have one comment, sir. Dr.
Yes.
S. Namaskar. It's a very well talk, organized, and very authentic. I have been reading your books as well, but this is very authentic, truthful, honest, and forceful presentation. And I bow down to you, to your scholarship, to your authenticity.
Thank you. By the way, I'm not sure, since the PowerPoint was on, that you could see the book I was showing. So I'll show it again. This is World Conquest in Installments with a picture of Stalin, because it is a comment, a running comment on writings by Stalin himself. What I should also show is the book version of the article series that Goelji wrote in 61, 62. This is the book Growth of Nehruism.
I have the copy of that one, not the first one. I will try to have a copy of the other one as well. If you can convey to exact title and publisher to Rajiv ji, then I will have the copy of that one too. I will try to get from the...
Yeah, well, this is all from Voice of India, the publishing house that Goelji himself founded. It's now run by his grandson. So it is Genesis and Growth of Nehruism, of which the first part was to be a commitment to communism. That's this article series. But he had wanted to add a second volume of deeper reflections on the relation between Nehru and communism and other aspects of Nehruism. But he was already too old for that. He didn't come around to do that anymore.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Dr. Els. Just like Arthur Koestler had written his, he edited that anthology, which basically started the unraveling of, the state communism in Europe. We have a situation today of the Frankfurt School of Marxism driven, intervention in academia, media, pop culture, so-called the woke culture. That is like eating the Hindu society from the inside. In terms of intellectual work, and specifically pertaining to Sitaram Goelji's thinking, would you walk us through the pending work that needs to be done to unravel the Marxist school of the Frankfurt School of Marxism?
Well, I think that is a new work to be done. I mean, of course, there are many articles are now being written in all these online papers that pro-Hindus have started, in which the woke ideology is, well, not yet thoroughly analyzed, but once in a while it comes in for criticism. But, that's a new thing to be done. with that, Goelji did not occupy himself. It was at that time also not known at all in India. The neo-Marxists of the Frankfurt school, they specifically want to destroy traditions deemed conservative of the people and make them all like numbers, deprive them of anything specific or a specific people or a specific community. And that was not at all the issue yet when Goelji was working. On the contrary, he notes that the communists, or more vaguely the left, was often very true to many elements of Hindu society, even though they didn't call themselves Hindu. Like in culture,
As per the order, huh?
they would support all manner of culture under different mottos. They wouldn't say, "Oh, this is Hindu art; this has to be preserved," but they would say, "Oh, this is folk art. This is laborers' art. This is anti-colonial. This goes against the imposition of American stuff on us," and so on. So for all kinds of other reasons, they would preserve handicrafts, preserve music traditions, and so on. Often they were very at home in Hindu culture. Whereas, today, as Goelji's acolyte Shrikant Talageri has written, right now the BJP is pursuing exactly the opposite course. Is frantically supporting the Americanization of political discourse, but also of cultural life. And so in that sense, you see, the old communists are an example. I personally met several times Professor Romila Thapar, and she's very dignified, very, very tasteful, show of Hindu culture, just simply the way she's dressed, her good manners and so on. I mean, if she's a bit, not our side in terms of her view of history, okay, that's one thing, but nevertheless, she is not disloyal to Hindu culture as such. And so if you look at the woke tradition today, well, that's a wholly different ball game from the old communism that Goelji was preoccupied with. So, of course, I'm all for resistance against this woke movement, but for that we can't really turn to Goelji, except in a very general sense that, of course, he was for authenticity, for truth. That of course remains an entirely valid concern today. But his critique of communism was of a different kind of communism than the one we are facing today.
Okay, so I see K. Kayanji. Is that your name, Kayanji? You can unmute yourself now.
Hi, my name is Karthi, actually. Thank you, sir. It was a very enlightening talk. I think my question was partly answered by previously, the previous question. But, and basically I'm from Australia. And here they say generally that if there's a saying here that when you are young, if you don't vote the left, you don't have a heart. And when you're older, if you don't vote the right, you don't have a brain. So that's what the thing is. But what I noticed is that generally most of the youngsters are getting carried on by the communist ideology, as if that's the way to liberate the masses, and the infiltration into the universities, both in India and here, is quite significant. And naturally, being a Hindu society, there is not a big resistance to that. That communist ideology added with the caste oppression and things like that, it's a cocktail for disaster. And people like Goel ji and yourself have done a lot of work, but is there a kind of avenue or a kind of a systematic party system where the next generation is able to get involved and have the confidence and courage to resist communism and give an alternative theory, as you've been doing? What do we have for the next generation? What can we do to promote that as well?
Yeah, that is a very important question. But let's start with the proverb you were quoting. You see, I ought to be flattered myself by this proverb, because I was a leftist when I was 20, and I was totally something else by the time I was 40. Okay. The same thing counts, of course, for Goelji. You know, he started as a leftist and then he became anti-left. Now, you know, as having some experience with this shift, I would say that those who were non-leftist at age 20, and they existed and we always looked down on them. And, you know, they were right, after all. You see, we were not influenced by them. We shifted away from the left, you know, on our own inspiration, through our own experiences. But nevertheless, we joined them. You see, they were on the right and they remained on the right all the time, and they were right. So let's not flatter ourselves with having gone through a leftist phase. On the other hand, you see, I see what you mean, that typically it is the talented youngsters who go through this phase because they want to take initiative, they want to change things, they want to make their mark and so on. And so while not having yet come to the years of discrimination, they fall for the dominant vogue, the ideology that is in. Okay, so that's Goel's story, that's Ramsarup's story, that's my own story. And there's very many people's stories. Like, for instance, last week, the Greek composer Mikis Theodorakis died. In the news account of this, everybody remembered his pro-communist days in the 60s, 70s. Nobody mentioned that in his later years, he had turned against communism and written some seriously pro-conservative views. So there are very many who have gone through this evolution, but very few have made such work of it, have given such expression to it as Goelji. Now, what about the present generation? Right now, of course, we are in a far more dire situation than back then, because people are massively getting influenced by the enormous influx of modern, mostly American cultural trends. And so this is going much faster in India than at any time in the past. You see, now there are TVs, or after TV, there are on the smartphone, there are all media available to everyone in India in the remotest village. And so as long as the media are mostly in the hands of, what I could call the enemy, well, they are going to have an enormous influence on the youth, and that's what you can see. Now, against that, there is a counter trend. We see that online media have opened an enormously useful avenue for pro-Hindu forces. In the past, it was difficult to set up a publishing house and especially difficult to reach the people. Now, this is much easier. And even with the very hostile attitude of the technology giants in social media, especially, social media remain an avenue of reaching people. Of course, you have to be nowadays a bit clever about it. It's a kind of guerrilla, but still, you see, much is possible. And so we see that very many online media have been started. Some are pro-RSS, but mostly they are not. They are pro-Hindu and they're independent, and there are different strands. Some call themselves rightists, some emphatically don't want to call themselves rightists, don't want this Western categorization. Some are really conservative, like for instance on the Sabarimala temple, they supported the tradition that women of fertile age should get no entry there. Even especially many women supported that. And others are very matter-of-fact, rational, nationalist, and so on. So there are a number of different strands, and they all find expression now through the online media. So in terms of the intellectual struggle, or intellectually, find the Hindus finding their own feet, finally, that is happening. That has not at all yet reached the stage where it can have any political influence. I don't see the BJP being influenced by it, almost on the contrary. And so ways have to be found to get this message across to the circles that matter or that make a difference. But still, you see, the trend is very visible. And so, it's hard to tell right now, but my experience with the enormous cultural change that has taken place since the 60s in Western society, first drifting to the left, then reviving the right and so on. I mean, a number of trends have taken place. And so I do not at all discount the possibility that India too will become more Hinduized, more sensitive to Hindu concerns in the near future. But that's work to do, There is nothing, no Krishna descending from heaven to arrange this for you. This is a time when Hindus themselves have to do it. And so many are doing it, but whether that is going to be sufficient, that remains to be seen. That's, a struggle we are waging, and we are not absolutely sure of the outcome.
Okay. Thank you. Pradeep ji, I see your hand is raised. You can unmute yourself.
Pronouns to Dr. Gelst. My question is for today's generation. Between his life of Sitaram Goelji versus his works, which one you think is more important, and which one you think would be more the important message that would be valuable for the generation from Goelji?
Well, seeing this to the extent that such a thing is possible, of course, through the eyes of Goelji himself, of course, his life is not important. I mean, he had his story, and everybody has his story. And so, yes, of course, I'm telling that story here today, and you can learn a few things from it. But ultimately, it's his legacy that is important. That is what the next generation can take with it. So his books are there, and absolutely deserve to be studied. So I hope that the attention he is getting right now in the centenary year will attract people to his work and make it more familiar again. So, and this remains very important. Of course, there are new issues that he did not foresee, that he did not work on. Like, for instance, this Rajiv Malhotra has published a book on the effects of artificial intelligence and how that's going to influence India as well as the rest of the world. That's very important. Those issues were not thought about in Goel's circles and in Goel's time. So there are a number of new issues. Nevertheless, there are also very familiar issues that are still with us. Like, for instance, you have right now an enormous Christian missionary offensive, even reaching Punjab, with the once very self-satisfied Sikh community that is now going over to the Christian challenger in record numbers. There is, of course, the permanent challenge of Islam. You should not magnify too much the threat of Islam. If you are sober like a warrior, you do not indulge in the kind of paranoia that I see often in Hindu circles, saying that, oh yeah, we are too weak and they are very determined and they are very strong and so on. That is somewhat true, but then look at the different evolution of India and Pakistan. Pakistan is becoming a Chinese colony. And so in backward places like Afghanistan, it can still score some successes. But, when you compare it to India, it's in a bad way. And so I wouldn't exaggerate the Islamic danger. Also demographically, for instance, the number of births among Muslims is coming down. It's still higher than the Hindu number, admittedly. But it's not like as if they are consciously waging a demographic war. So I wouldn't exaggerate that. But of course, if you sit by idly, then you are going to get a situation where Hindus become a minority in India, which if you see the fate of minorities in, for instance, Pakistan, then that's not very desirable. So that ought to be avoided. But I think policies like Ghar Wapasi, which is not supported by the government at all, but which is tried by some idealistic Hindus, that can make a difference. There are internal developments within the Islamic world where quite a few are now, and this is also thanks to modern technology, are getting to know the newest developments in historical scholarship, which is undermining Islam very fundamentally. And so that is reaching more and more educated Muslims. And so the Muslim community is not that phalanx that Hindus imagine. So again, you see, if Hindus play their cards well, they ought to be able to survive. And which I think is the most important thing at the moment. As Goelji said, right now, perhaps for the first time in history, the disappearance of Hinduism is a real possibility. And so, I think we have to remain conscious of that. That, we are by the side of the abyss, but nevertheless, it's not hopeless at all. You should just soberly assess the situation. And so there are factors in your favor, there are other factors, but it's not like one side, the negative side is all powerful and is fated to win and to make Hinduism disappear. I don't think that that is about to happen.
Okay.
Is that an answer to your question?
Yes.
Anything else?
Just,
Yeah.
just a follow-up one. So if you were to recommend one work of Goelji's, of all the ones as a prominent one, which one would you recommend?
Oh, yeah, well, the one that I think is most important to know, and the one that I would wish all these politicians, Advani and Modi and so on, had read and had interiorized, is the long introduction to the Calcutta Quran petition. The Calcutta Quran petition is a comment on a text by citizen Chanmal Chopra, who had tried to ban a number of verses of the Quran which called for violence against unbelievers and which are against the, or which ought to be against the law of India, or already of British India, against insulting religions. And so he went to court. Of course, he didn't get anywhere. The judges didn't really want to entertain his argumentation against these verses. They said it's a sacred scripture, and about that we cannot sit in judgment and so on. So that case really went nowhere. However, the comment by Goelji, that is important. And so initially it was just an introduction explaining the facts of the matter and so on. But in the last edition, he gave a very important, lengthy foreword where he explained the nature of prophetism and why we should not fall for this, why any self-respecting Muslim who really studies the matter should just leave Islam and question these basic Islamic beliefs. So your policy vis-a-vis Islam will be more rational if you know this, and not the way that some online sources and American university sources and so on would say, oh, he's the most extremist anti-Muslim. That's not true at all. He's extreme, if you want, in his criticism of Islam. He doesn't mince words, and he shows exactly where the problem lies, where the pain points are. But he was a very nice man vis-a-vis Muslims. It is through him that I've gotten to know some Indian Muslims personally, and we were on friendly terms, but usually not going deep into theological matters. I don't know if the mutual goodwill would have survived that. Anyway, like when there was news about communal riots, he would show a sort of painful face, really feeling for the suffering that people were going through, regardless of whether they were Muslims or Hindus. By the way, in the 50s, when mostly writing against communism, he also took time to write a few novels in Hindi and historical novels about the Buddha's life, as well as a few studies about, a few translations of parts of the Tripitaka, or the Pali canon. And so, unlike many conservative Hindus, theistic Hindus have no use for Buddhism at all. He was quite close to Buddhism, and particularly this value of karuna, of maitri, he cultivated. So in fact, even vis-a-vis Joseph Stalin, he writes in his book, How I Became a Hindu, that he learned Hindu meditation techniques already at that time. And that so one thing, one that is practiced nowadays still at these Buddhist retreats of Vipassana. So one technique they learn is metta, which is Sanskrit Maitri, which means friendship, or is usually translated as loving kindness. And so the idea is that you first, imagine, visualize your love before yourself, your loved ones, and so on. But then in concentric circles, you include the people you hate. And so finally, the last face he saw before his mind's eye was Stalin. And so he always made a very careful distinction between your fellow feeling towards other people, including enemies, versus the fearless criticism of the ideology that makes even good people, even well-meaning people, do evil things. So he was not anti-Muslim, he was anti-Islamic. That's a big difference. You see, in the last few decades, there have been many Western interventions, I mean military interventions, in the Middle East, from Libya to Afghanistan. And if you care to look into the background of all the politicians who have ordered these military missions, each of them, without exception, has spoken in favor of Islam, has praised Islam as a great religion, and so on, all while announcing on TV that they were starting a mission to kill Muslims, to kill people who were in their way and who happened to be Muslims. So, if I would hear a politician like that, like Obama, like Bill Clinton, like John Kerry, like Hillary Clinton also, who laughed when Gaddafi was killed, for example. When I hear them speak in favor of Islam, I'd be concerned, because speaking in favor of Islam often leads to killing Muslims. Whereas Goelji's approach was totally different. There's nobody on earth, I think, who has spoken more clearly and more critically about Islam, and yet he has never hurt the hair on the head of a single Muslim. So these are two different things. It's very important to make that distinction, because your enemies are always going to try to blur this.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? We do have a hard stop in 2 minutes. So if anybody has any questions, let us know.
Yeah. Namaste, this is Srikar.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Quick question. Yeah, we talked Islam, Hindutva in context of India, but looking at basically the fundamental Islam, it has problem in anywhere, right? What kind of transformation is globally or some happening for a fertile country in other Islamic nations? Even they cannot grow when they follow fundamental Islam.
Well, you see, in the last few years, we've seen a very positive evolution, and this is that many public figures in the Muslim world have seen and have spoken out against the negative effects of the fundamentalist movements, like the Muslim Brotherhood. They are being disowned massively by people who used to sponsor them. So they've not succeeded. I mean, and they are a very big influence on ISIS, on the Islamic State, which has given Islam a really bad name. I mean, you can see it here in Europe. The political class, the media are still all out in favor of Islam. And yet, you see, among the masses, the attitude towards Islam is just the opposite. They all know it. I mean, when they see on TV these images of Islamic State militants beheading people, they know enough about it. They know what they need to know about Islam. And all the propaganda is not going to change this. Now, this is also happening among Muslims to some extent. There are very many who have a hard time reconciling the religion that they have been taught by their beloved parents with these unpleasant expressions of Islamic intolerance. But so quite a few do take the logical conclusion and say, well, there is something wrong with Islam. And this is really more and more. In the West now, at the time of, for instance, the Satanic Verses affair in 1989, you didn't have that. Nowadays, in every Western country, you have a society of ex-Muslims. And in the West, they can do it more or less openly. In the Islamic countries, that's of course more difficult. But still, even there, you see that, for instance, the Pew, Institute's polls show an increase, a consistent increase of apostasy from Islam, de facto or formally. And so, and it's not even only among the younger generation, it's a very clear trend. And of course, you don't see it in India because here, Muslims are very much polarized vis-a-vis Hindus, and feel that they have to stand together and not entertain any doubts about the bedrock of their unity, namely the Islamic belief. But I mean, India will follow at some point, and so I think the Islamic onward march, demographic and institutional, like cornering ever more privileges in India. This is still going on under the Modi government too. In Europe, you see it also institutionally. They're establishing themselves more and more. But that tendency of growth, of expansion, both institutional and demographic, is counterbalanced by a weakening of Islam from the inside. And so I think we have to pay attention to this tendency and support it to the extent that we can. We should certainly not support anything that strengthens the grip of Islamic institutions over their flock, as some politicians in Europe are doing. And on the contrary, I mean, we cannot make Muslims leave Islam. I mean, you can make them say certain things if you apply force, but that doesn't influence what they really believe. On the contrary, it would evoke resistance. So you see, you should have a wise policy of nudging them towards the exit, of being sympathetic to any positive development, to any growth of more rational and more humanist outlook. But so I do think this is on the whole, on balance, I think that the situation is not that bad. It is challenging, yes, but it's not hopeless, no.
All right, thank you. I think we have a hard stop now. So
Okay.
I wish to thank Dr. Elst, and just in case the audience noticed, it is 4 a.m. his time. And since the subject is important, and we can see Dr. Elst's commitment to this India's intellectual freedom struggle, that he's working day in and day out. So if I may suggest this to the audience, if, some of you have supported him and his work, we urge you to keep supporting him, and so he can do the wonderful work. And everything requires support. And in case any of you want to support, I have put my email address there. Please do contact me. With that, Dr. Els, next session is on Monday on Ghazwa-e-Hind and jihad and iconoclasm. And Nalini ji and I will be back again hosting this. And Conradji, thank you very much. I truly appreciate you taking the time off and at this hour that too. And we'll see you on Monday. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Namaste.
Thank you.
Pranams to
Namaste.
Konradji. Pranams to Konradji.
Thank you.